It's that same mentality of seeking purity, seeking ideological conformism, trying to drive out heretics, suppress dissent. I observed the exact same mob-like behavior, perhaps even more aggressive mob-like behavior on the right than I did on the left. I don't dislike Elon. I actually now view him as a figure that should probably be pitied. I think he suffers from hubris and a very bad social media addiction.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd with me, Freddie Sayers. Claire Lehmann is the founding editor of the thoughtful and always interesting Australian publication Quillette that has built a global reputation throughout the dark and deranged years of woke by calling out mainly left-wing irrationality, attacks on science, curtailments of free speech and free thinking. So how did it happen that just last week Elon Musk called her an asshole? And she's now facing some kind of standoff with sections of her own readership who are surprised that she's critiquing Trump and Musk. So today, get ready to have your own biases questioned as Claire joins us from Sydney to ask, has the anti-woke crowd become its own irrational and reckless blob? Welcome to UnHerd, Claire.
Thanks for having me, Freddie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me just start by reading an extract of this email that you sent to your readers just the other week. I thought it was really interesting. Some readers have expressed confusion about our publication of critical pieces on the Trump administration over the past few weeks. While much of our editorial focus since our inception has addressed excesses of the left, from cancel culture to speech codes to identity politics, Quillette has never been defined merely by what we oppose. We are guided by principles which include intellectual freedom, evidence-based reasoning, and classical liberal values. When these principles come under threat from any direction, including the right, our commitment remains unchanged. Opposing one form of authoritarianism while embracing another is not principled criticism, but mere partisanship. How did it come about that you even needed to send that email?
I suppose I was receiving emails and I was reading comments on the articles that we were publishing from readers that were just expressing surprise, I suppose, and puzzlement with regards to some of the critical pieces we were publishing on Trump. I just felt it was time to say that, we're not just an anti-left or anti-woke publication, and we never have been. I see a liberalism growing on the right now, particularly in the United States, and I see woke authoritarianism sort of simmering down. It hasn't completely vanished, that's for sure, but it's simmering down. And so I feel that it's time to start highlighting the authoritarianism that is on the right before it metastasizes into something worse.
When did you found it? Was it 2015?
Yeah.
So it was really throughout that year. 2016, obviously Trump, right up to 2020. I think we took a slightly different view on the lockdowns. That was an earlier controversy where you also had some disagreements with your readers, but generally, you've been fighting against interference in academia, a lot about cancel culture, and generally what you would call illiberal ideas, which have mainly been coming from the left. What is it that you now see on the right that worries you?
I first noticed a liberalism within the academy when I realized that the discipline that I was studying, psychology, had political skew. There were far more academics who identify as being left-wing than conservative, and I realized through reading the scholarly work of psychologists such as Lee Jussum that this was producing bad research and bad scholarship. You get faulty ideas when you don't have ideological diversity. So when I first started Quillette, I was really interested in how politics sort of disforms academia. As time went on, we realized that this problem of political bias and skew happens in all sorts of different communities. So we were hearing more and more about artists who couldn't pursue creative freedom, or they didn't have freedom of expression because of the social environments they found themselves in. Their friends would judge them if they weren't on board with all of the fashionable theories regarding race and gender and so on. And so it was really apparent that there was this stifling culture in what you would normally consider centre-left or liberal sort of milieus. And so we published a book in 2019, I think, called Panics and Persecutions, which was an anthology of some of our best essays on that subject. Now, what I notice on the right is putting the political situation in the United States to one side, I definitely see the same sort of herdish tribal behavior, particularly on social media, where anything which can be taken out of context will suddenly become a viral clip. You know, like Sam Harris might say something and immediately there will be a viral clip taking it out of context, and it will be retweeted and tweeted by thousands of people on X. And it's that same mentality of seeking purity, seeking ideological conformism, trying to drive out heretics, suppress dissent. I observed the exact same mob-like behavior, perhaps even more aggressive mob-like behavior on the right than I did on the left. And to me, it's really remarkable how similar the two sides, the two tribes are in their behavior.
I mean, if we're going to try to be understanding of them, that was you're talking about 2015 to 2025 here. I mean, it's a long period where those people who were railing against the excesses of the left were unheard for many years. You know, they were losing that battle. And I guess, can we be understanding that there is a certain kind of exhilaration now that obviously with the re-election of Donald Trump, they seem to be winning the argument, and there's a sort of overcorrection in some way. I mean, can you understand their enthusiasm?
I do, I can. And, I was in the United States when Trump won the election last year, and I was among people who voted for Trump, and I was very affected by positive vibes and optimism. And, these people were very intelligent people, moderate people. I was certainly hopeful at the beginning of the administration, and I'm sure all of my friends were optimistic, and some of them would remain optimistic. But I think with some of the developments that have occurred since the new administration has been in power, I think it's very clear that we're now facing a different situation where if one is classical liberal and is committed to liberal principles, one really must take a stand to defend those principles, because I think some of the moves of the current administration are authoritarian and they are quite scary. And so, I mean, I can understand people wanting to get carried away on social media and join mobs, just like people on the left wanted to get carried away and join mobs on social media. I mean, it's human nature to want to join a tribe and publicly humiliate one's enemies. My patience and my tolerance for that kind of behavior is not going to last terribly long.
So you use the word classical liberal there. I mean, we don't want to get into different definitions too much, but you think you have to explain maybe what that is, because obviously liberal is this loaded word. In an American context, it means left generally. What do you mean by classical liberal principles?
A classical liberal believes that due process is sacrosanct. The rights of the individual are sacrosanct. We are an individual before we are a member of a group. So I'm myself before I'm a woman. I'm not just an avatar for my identity group. We believe in the scientific method, for example, being the best way of discovering truths about reality. And obviously, as a British person yourself, you would understand the history of classical liberal thought, and the respect of pluralism and property rights and freedom of religion all go hand in hand with respecting the autonomy and the rights of the individual against the tyranny of the mob.
Okay, so let's get into these examples then. What is it that you see being done in the States that you think transgresses those principles? I mean, should we start with your spat with Elon, for example? That might be an interesting place to begin. You basically tweeted this. It said, "I'm sorry, but the world's wealthiest individual levering their wealth for political influence and power, cannot claim victimhood when the inevitable backlash engulfs his business interests. The narcissistic entitlement here is off the charts. You were quoting a video where Elon Musk was complaining on the Joe Rogan show that his businesses were being targeted because of political interests. A whole long exchange ensued, which ended with, "You're an asshole," and you then said, "Better than being a victim." What's your beef with Elon?
To be clear, I'm a huge admirer of Elon Musk's achievements as an entrepreneur. I read the biography of him written by Walter Isaacson, and I was really blown away by not just his tenacity and vision, but the achievements he made when it came to innovation in the Tesla factory. So it's not just that he's engineering genius, he actually is a genius when it comes to designing a production line. You know, he probably exceeds Henry Ford in that level of genius. So I do actually think he's a genius, and he's doing great things for humanity, particularly when it comes to SpaceX. I don't dislike Elon. I actually now view him as a figure that should probably be pitied. I think he suffers from hubris and a very bad social media addiction. And the issue I have with his recent behavior is that it's obviously corrupt to be the CEO of companies which receive a multi-million-dollar subsidies from a government, and then also run PACs or super PACs which donate hundreds of millions of dollars to a particular candidate's election, and then take a job within government. Like, that's just corrupt. It would be illegal in my country, Australia. I'm sure it would be illegal in Britain. I think it would be illegal in most democracies. You can't. There are so many conflicts of interest, and they are so profound when we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's not illegal in the United States. The United States has what I would call many ways to be legally corrupt. Although it's not illegal, I would still characterize his appointment to Doge as being corrupt. And I think if you're going to pursue that path, you have to own the inevitable consequences. And I mean, he's smart enough to know that there's going to be a huge backlash against his association.
I share your disquiet, put it that way, about someone who has such enormous business interests that are so closely tied to the government then taking a job. I mean, technically they said it's not inside the government, but given that, and he's not actually a cabinet minister, but given that he attends and seems to pretty much direct cabinet meetings more than a secretary of state, I tweeted on the 12th of November, just literally the same day when he got this job, I said, "Hey, Elon, congrats on new government job. Will you be formally recusing yourself from all decisions at X? Otherwise, it literally becomes a government mouthpiece, which is what you were rightly so outraged about over the Twitter files." I got a whole load of heat for that, but that's a similar point, really, which is that it seems to be a bit of a challenge to liberal ideas about separation of media and government to have the main speech platform owned and directed by the number two person in the government. I mean, this was the complaint, wasn't it, during a lot, for example, the Twitter files, that the government was somehow setting the rules for the speech forum, which felt like a real risk to free speech. And now it's literally the number two person in the government who owns the main speech forum. Are you worried about that?
Absolutely. I have no particular sympathies for the Democratic Party. I think, they've done a terrible job on multiple levels. The most persuasive critiques to me of the systemic problems in American democracy was that it had become oligarchic. Now, and we need, I've heard people on the dissident right and theorists argue that America had become this ossified oligarchy, and they needed a revolution to get rid of this ancient regime. But what's emerging now is a new oligarchy with even more centralized power in even fewer individuals, people such as Elon Musk. And It does obviously contradict classical liberal principles, because the more power that is centralized in very wealthy plutocrats, the less power there is throughout through the democratic population. I think most people with I don't think you need to be a classical liberal to be concerned with what's happening in the United States right now, and with the power that Elon Musk is wielding. I think all sensible people are disquieted and unnerved by what's going on. Yeah, I think there will be a backlash of epic proportions.
Specifically, do you think there are threats to free speech and free inquiry that are posed by this new regime?
Oh, absolutely. And we can already see that in who Elon Musk is banning from X. He has banned protesters in Turkey who are protesting the current autocratic regime. He's banned journalists on flimsy grounds and then has reinstated them. But this idea that he was ever going to be a free speech absolutist, it's just been proven wrong. And at the same time, I think it's very difficult to run a commercial business while being a free speech absolutist. I think there are all sorts of principles in tension, and it's always going to be completely difficult. But what I don't admire is the pretense of being a free speech absolutist while cracking down on speech just, according to whim.
I mean, I have been surprised by how few free speech activists have been speaking against Elon Musk. Lots of them I consider friends and have great respect for, but there is a sense still, I think, that, and if you speak privately to them, they will say that, yes, he's not perfect. The way that X is run maybe could be better, and in some ways it's got worse, but net, they still see him as a positive force for free speech, because the previous arrangement in the old Twitter was so kind of ossified and secretive and bureaucratic and sinister that they think the new chaos is actually, it's kind of ugly at times, but at least you know what's happening. And there's one guy at the top, he's apparently autistic and will share every last thought he has in live time on Twitter, but you know where he's coming from. And that is chaotic, but at least it feels more real than whatever was there before. What would you say to them?
I think I probably shared that outlook at the start, but I have become increasingly concerned from observing Musk's behavior on the platform and the amount of disinformation that he shares, particularly on the topic of Ukraine. I think it's unnerving because it's not that he's actively suppressing speech that that counters his narrative, but in amplifying false information, he's really polluting the information ecosystem in a way that I can't think of any other example in the past 10 years where the information ecosystem has been just so utterly polluted by obvious lies and obvious distortions of the truth by one individual.
So you used the word disinformation there. That's going to be triggering, to use another word that I don't normally like, for some of our viewers, perhaps, because disinformation was this concept that was never really used about 10 years ago, and it has been built up mainly by people I oppose, I will say, to police free speech. And it was a way of making something sound official and making it sound legitimate to censor things, when actually in many cases they were just differences of opinion or contested factual claims. Do you really think that Elon Musk is crossing a new threshold when it comes to disinformation, or is he just out there fighting and using whatever facts he comes across in the same way that every other normal person is?
So I can understand why you don't like the term disinformation, because it's often used by people who just want to shut down political debate and who have a very limited sort of narrow view of what is acceptable discourse, and actually, like you, prefer to have a much wider Overton window than a lot of these censorious people would prefer. So we can get rid of that word disinformation and just call it lies. I think Elon Musk spreads lies about Ukraine. So does Donald Trump. The lie that Ukraine started the war, the lie that Zelensky has the power to just make a decision and there will be a ceasefire. I mean, I think that's a lie, and I think that Trump and Musk know that, but they're promoting this lie for their own reasons, which I think are quite sinister. And nothing good will come of it when we can't recognize the truth of a democratic nation being invaded by a much larger imperial dictatorship. I just don't see the upside in tolerating lies at that level.
I would see it slightly differently in that, there is this whole realist school. There is a whole much contested version of the history of that conflict where people who have, a legitimate argument that NATO expansion, reckless claims of Ukraine being about to be absorbed into NATO, changes of government in 2014, etc., all posed a threat to Russia, which could be described as starting the war. And that's what they would mean when they say that. I wouldn't sign up to that description myself, but I feel like we've got to be careful before banning whole phrases just because they are contentious, maybe overly simplistic. I feel people should be allowed to take that view if that's what they believe.
Ukraine didn't start the war. There were no Ukrainian tanks rolling into Russia. It was the other way around. The realists can put their case about what the root causes have been for Russia's war of aggression. That's fine. But you can't, if it's raining outside, you can't say that it's sunny. Like, reality exists. And just as I oppose people who say that a man can become a woman, I'm going to oppose people who get basic facts wrong on such a serious event as a land war in Europe.
And do you believe that people like Elon Musk, people who are supporting him, know that these things are factually incorrect and are saying them anyway? Or do you think that they have just rolled with these sort of minority view arguments and surrounded themselves with people who agree with them to such an extent that they can make these statements that to you seem like out and out lies or factually incorrect statements and genuinely believe them?
I mean, if I were to guess, I would say that they know these statements are wrong, but they're making them for instrumental purposes. They want, someone like Elon Musk wants the war to end, and they see that putting pressure on Zelensky to capitulate is probably the most effective way of doing that. And, I'm open to arguments that that is a legitimate position. I just don't like the lies.
Let's broaden beyond the Ukraine example, because we could spend a whole hour on that. Let's take universities as another example. I mean, there was this recent case of Mahmoud Khalil, who is a green card holding student at Columbia University, and there's been this whole campaign to eject him from the country based on his very unpleasant, to many people's, protests on things that he was saying and events that he attended. What's your view on that? Is that dangerous?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous anytime there is not a proper procedure and due process isn't followed. I mean, this individual was on a green card, is on a green card, and I've heard arguments that the reason he was ejected is because he lied on his green card application. Because when you make a green card application, you have to say whether or not you're associated with any authoritarian regimes, and Hamas and Hezbollah are included in those prescribed organizations. So perhaps he lied, and perhaps that's a reasonable offense to get rid of someone out of your country, right? But you have to go through the proper procedure. You can't just whip someone off a university campus, put them in handcuffs, and away they go. It's the same situation as what happened to those alleged gang members who were put on the planes and flown to El Salvador. Do we know that every single one of them was a gang member? What crimes were they guilty of? We don't know, because due process wasn't followed. And, we know we know because it's happened so many times. As soon as you start chipping away at due process, or as soon as there's enough moral panic around a particular group of people that you're willing to get rid of due process, innocent people get caught up in the panic and are punished or scapegoated because of it. And we know this because it happens every single time due process is sidelined.
I mean, look, I think very few people would make the argument that the Trump administration is especially interested in due process. I think its defenders would say that, yes, they have to be a bit rough and ready with due process, because what's happened over preceding decades has become so outrageously intolerable, and the sort of power structures have assembled around bureaucracies that make actually taking action to restore democratic will so difficult that they need to be a bit rough and ready. I mean, that is generally the argument you will hear from Trump supporters right now. Even people who might describe themselves as classical liberals, I would say that. Let's take this specific example. I think they would say that in order to have a functioning classically liberal society with those proper processes and institutions, borders are important, and that those rights should only be afforded to citizens of that polity, not the entire world. That leads to chaos. And therefore, if before you're a citizen, if you are there on something like a green card, which is not the same as a citizen, you have less rights, basically. If you are someone who starts supporting enemies of that country or terrorist groups, out you go, basically. They've got to be a bit more muscular to defend that delicate society. What do you say to that argument?
Yeah, look, I'm open to those arguments. However, I would just point out that how do you determine whether or not someone is a citizen? Can you just look at a person and see whether or not they're a citizen? We don't have citizenship tattoos on our arms or barcodes on our forehead. You determine whether or not someone is a citizen by going through a process, and I would call that due process. And if you don't have a due process for determining someone's citizenship, you could just be as rounding up people who are citizens and including them in a group of people who are illegal aliens. So I would always come back to the truth, which is that if we're going to accuse people of being illegal aliens or being gang members or being sex offenders or being whatever, we need to apply the principles of natural justice, which means giving them a fair hearing, letting them make their own case, and taking time so that they can defend themselves to present their side of the story. Otherwise,
I mean, if you don't have a passport, you're not a citizen. I think that's reasonably clear-cut. Lawyers may be watching this and saying, well, actually, green card holders are citizens. But for illegal aliens, quote unquote, people who are actually inside a particular country without having followed the due process to get there, what's your attitude to them? Because a lot of the political energy is about how forceful you can be in removing them. I mean, would you support roundups and mass deportations of people who didn't follow due process?
We need to be more selective over who we let into our countries. And I have absolutely no problem with the idea that borders, particularly in the United States, need to be controlled more assertively or aggressively. I just oppose the idea of rounding people up for being alleged gang members and shipping them off to a foreign country where apparently they get put into a labor camp. Like, I think that's a few steps ahead of control, putting stricter barriers around one's border.
Let me throw another example at you, Claire. I mean, I'm enjoying this because these are the grey areas, aren't they? These are the ones that people need to think about. So universities, you've really thought a lot about this, and Quillette has been at the forefront of thinking about what academic freedom should mean. The Trump administration and a lot of people on the right now think that a much more sort of direct approach to universities needs to be taken, with pretty much mandates about what they can and can't do in order to try to eject the kind of woke ideology that has captured those institutions, right? So they will say, if you want a classical liberal outcome, you now need to forcibly eject this kind of cancerous growth that has taken over these universities, even though it's a bit of an unpleasant process, in order to restore something like an equal playing ground. Where do you stand on that? Do you think things like government mandates about DEI policies at universities, banning them, talk about what kind of things can be taught in classrooms, those kind of direct interventions by government, do you support them, or do they make you uncomfortable?
So I do actually support getting rid of DEI as an institutional policy for taxpayer-funded institutions. If you want to have a private university that is devoted to the values of DEI, go for it, but pay for it with your own money. I think if universities are going to be supported by taxpayer dollars, then we need to be really clear about what a university is for. And traditionally, the universities have their prestige because they are seen as bastions of meritocracy, which DEI contradicts. So I do actually agree with government mandates to get rid of DEI out of universities, particularly when it comes to hiring practices. I've long been skeptical of affirmative action because it rubs against the notion that individuals are judged on their own merits as opposed to the membership of their group. At the same time, I do think academic freedom needs to be protected, and I would definitely oppose any policy that determines what can be taught inside classrooms. I am quite aghast at the cuts to legitimate scientific research that have happened under the auspices of Doge. There's so much going on that it's hard to respond because there's so much chaos and the zone is so flooded. There's so many different things happening at once that I think everybody watching what's going on is quite discombobulated.
Just to take that example, so there was recently a news story that the Trump administration is withholding funding, for example, to the University of Pennsylvania on the grounds that they are still handling transgender identifying students in a way that contravenes the new Trump policies with regards to sport.
Yeah.
Right. So this is something you're in favor of biological reality, kind of an absurd statement to have to make, but you've been very clear on that and you would support universities not putting men into women's sports. Right. Fair enough. Would you then support the government withdrawing funding for universities that continue to push transgender ideology?
No, I wouldn't, but I don't think that means that the universities get out of jail free for pushing these pernicious ideologies and pernicious policies. I think there's probably much more important research that's being done with the funding that is more important than the transgender policy when it comes to their swimming pool, right? At the same time, I also think these universities should be constrained in some way because we've covered the such policies for years at Quillette, and they do prioritizing transgender women over the rights of biological females hurts biological females. For example, the policies that were brought in under the Obama administration, which sought to punish alleged sex offenders on university campuses, there was all of this collateral damage where innocent males were accused of crimes they did not commit. So any institution that is receiving taxpayer funding needs to be held accountable, and if they're enforcing policies which cause harm and restrict the rights of people within those institutions, then they should definitely suffer some consequences. I don't think restricting their funding altogether is the answer, though.
And I presume the same is true of questions like Israel, protests in support of Hamas, those kinds of things. You would say if the university breaches a line and starts to allow things that are harmful or risk the free thought of their students, they should be punished in some way. And federal funding is one way to do that? Question mark? I don't know. Where do you draw the line on that one?
I am definitely sympathetic to people who say the universities have damaged themselves, they've damaged their reputations, they damaged their own reputations, and they need someone with a big stick to come through and purge them not only of unfair policies such as DEI hiring practices, but also these pernicious ideologies that have become so fashionable within them. This is really difficult because a lot of good work still gets done in the universities. I guess you draw the line according to how much collateral damage you're willing to inflict. We would just differ according to that ratio.
If we kind of zoom out, I feel like what we're coming up against is how rageful you are or are not about the bureaucracy that has built up over recent years. And I think a lot of the people inside the Trump movement, and I understand this, really feel like the bureaucracy that has built up using things like classical liberal principles as a defense, using quote unquote due process as a way to obscure and thwart the will of the people, has built up to such a degree that they just have less interest in people claiming that, a due process is being breached here, or, you're offending my classical liberal principles, because they think they've heard that. They've heard those arguments being deployed in defense of all sorts of stuff that they feel was genuinely evil. So they have a much higher tolerance to just bashing through it. I feel like that's an explanation of
revenge.
How... Yes.
Yeah, well, it's didn't we learn when we were children that revenge is not not a way to seek justice? It's not the best way to see good outcomes in the world.
Do you think there are people making the case for the kind of principles you believe in? Do you see them? Are there prominent people with big platforms who are defending those ideas, or do you feel that's now a kind of a minority view? And the big battle is the kind of the left versus the right?
Oh yeah, there's lots of people who are articulating liberal principles. People like Helen Pluckrose, lots of writers who write for Quillette. There's lots of people out there. Sam Harris, I think, articulates liberal principles and always has. The problem is that you will be hated by both sides, and it's difficult to be hated by both sides. It takes a certain amount of, I guess you'd have to say, resilience to be able to withstand mobs and vitriol from both political sides. It's much easier to absorb hate from one political side when you've got the other political side sort of barracking for you and defending you and coming to your aid when you're being attacked. I think we, as a society, we are collectively becoming a little bit more resilient to the kind of harassment that you get online for sticking your neck out and articulating what you truly believe. I think we are getting a little bit better at understanding that mobs just come and go, and you can sort of just switch off your computer and walk away and come back in 2 days and everybody's hyperventilating about something else. I think the trouble is, though, and you alluded to this earlier, that some of us in the media have built large audiences that may skew in one political direction. And when a whole chunk of them drop off and stop subscribing to you, there's a financial cost there. So I think if one is to be true to one's principles, we have to we have to absorb the financial costs as well.
So you're talking about commentators, YouTube stars, journalists, people who now, because of these new business models, which themselves were a way of escaping the old gatekeepers and the kind of power of the legacy media to set the tone of the conversation. So these new business models have been great for free speech because they enable people to reach wide audiences who take different views. They are now much more directly kind of responding to the people that pay their wages each week if they're on Substack or on YouTube. And therefore to take them on a point of principle becomes harder, ironically, than it used to be in the legacy media.
That's right, because the legacy media, you are accountable to advertisers and accountable to a board and the owner and the publisher, ultimately. It's potentially more ideologically diffuse. You don't know what ideology all of the different advertisers have, other than that they want to sell their products and make some money. But when you've built up an audience that is not just of one ideological persuasion, but are really engaged and really actively passionate advocates of a particular ideological persuasion, it can be a bit challenging. And I've often said to people that, in the business of media and journalism, the customer is not always right. And you do occasionally have to fight with your own audience. And I've had to fight with my own audience in the past, and it's very unpleasant. Nobody wants to fight with their own audience. It's an anathema to business. However, to protect your own editorial integrity and to protect the integrity of one's publication, you do actually have to take a stand from time to time. Not all of the time, but every now and then something happens and you just have to take a stand, and you just have to draw a line in the sand and say, I am not moving beyond this point. This is what I believe in. And, I'm willing to suffer the costs. I'm willing to suffer the destruction of my media company if it comes to it. Like that's how committed one has to be.
And have you been disappointed how few people have done that? I mean, do you want to name names here, Claire? I mean, who should we be disappointed in?
I don't know if I'm disappointed, but I'm always disappointed by cowardice wherever I see it. And I wish more people realize that it's better to suffer the slings and arrows by putting your neck out there and standing up for what you believe than playing it safe and trying to go along with the crowd and get along with one's peers, get along with one's audience, get along with one's friends. It's better to stick one's neck out, even if it's painful in the short term. I think long term you develop a strength of character that I think is useful, and it serves one well in business and in other endeavors.
Well, let's see just how many negative comments we get at the foot of this video, Claire. That will be an interesting experiment. And we can have a kind of support group if that does happen. As always, a pleasure. Thanks for coming on to UnHerd, and let's talk again very soon. That was Claire Lehmann, the founding editor of Quillette magazine out of Australia, which for nearly 10 years has been involved in various culture war and intellectual arguments. And I guess some people will have heard that and thought, what a shame. That Claire Lehmann, she was so sound on anti-woke and on free speech and on all the important topics. And now she seems to be afflicted with Trump derangement syndrome. We're going to have to express our disappointment in the comments. Other people will be thinking the opposite. Claire Lehmann, now she was always one of the wrong ones over those culture war years. She was clearly fighting on the dark side, but now she seems to have seen the light and she's saying nasty things about Donald Trump. Let's give her a second look. Hopefully, there is a third group of you who will be thinking, she had interesting things to say then, she has interesting things to say now, and please continue to check her out at quillette.com. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.